He thought his grandfather left him nothing, but his German shepherd knew the old house was hiding something. Ethan Walker heard the words from the attorney on a quiet Tuesday morning, standing alone in his small apartment with a cup of untouched coffee in his hand. The call was supposed to be simple: a final inheritance notice, a few legal documents, a goodbye from a family member who was no longer there to explain anything. But the message left him with a strange feeling. His grandfather had passed away, and the only thing left in his name was an old farmhouse sitting on several acres of land outside a small town in Ohio. No savings, no valuable collections, no family treasure, just an aging house that most people had already forgotten. Ethan thanked the attorney and ended the call. For a few moments, he simply stood there in silence. After 20 years serving as a United States Marine, he had learned not to expect much from life. You did your duty. You carried your memories. You moved forward. But somewhere deep inside, he had hoped his grandfather might have left behind a final message, something that said he mattered. Instead, all he had was an old house filled with unknown memories. 2 days later, Ethan arrived at the farmhouse with Bear, his 5-year-old German shepherd, sitting calmly in the passenger seat. The road stretched through quiet fields and empty farmland, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. Ethan had not visited this property since he was a teenager. Back then, his grandfather seemed like a man who knew every corner of the world but rarely explained anything about himself. He remembered the smell of fresh wood inside the house, the sound of old radios playing in the kitchen, and the way his grandfather would spend hours repairing things that others would have thrown away. As the farmhouse came into view, Ethan slowed the truck. The building looked exactly how he imagined. Weathered wooden walls, a faded front porch, tall grass moving gently in the wind. It did not look like a treasure. It looked like a place everyone had left behind. Ethan stepped out of the vehicle, and Bear followed. The German shepherd looked around, carefully, taking in every sound and scent around the property. Ethan smiled softly. "It is just an old house, buddy," he said. But Bear did not seem convinced. While Ethan unlocked the front door, Bear walked toward the side of the farmhouse and stopped near a small area behind the barn. His ears lifted slightly. His attention remained fixed on the ground. Ethan noticed and walked closer. "What did you find?" he asked. Bear moved slowly around the area, then looked back at Ethan as if waiting for him to understand. There was nothing obvious. No broken fence. No sign of anyone being there. Just an old section of land covered with leaves and forgotten grass. Ethan made a mental note to check it later. Inside the farmhouse, the memories returned faster than he expected. The wooden table was still there. The old clock still hung on the wall. Family photographs rested on dusty shelves. It felt less like entering an abandoned home and more like opening a book that someone had stopped reading years ago. Ethan walked from room to room, noticing small details about his grandfather's life. A collection of handwritten notes, old military photographs, tools carefully arranged in the garage. His grandfather had kept everything organized, as if he believed every object had a purpose. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Bear beside him, watching the sunset over the fields. He still believed the inheritance was nothing more than an old farmhouse. But Bear kept looking toward the barn, toward the same quiet corner of land. And just before the light disappeared, the German shepherd stood up and walked back toward the place he had noticed earlier. This time, Ethan followed. Beneath the leaves, hidden beside the old barn, Bear stopped near a section of ground that looked different from the rest. Ethan brushed away the leaves with his hand. Something hard touched his fingers. It was not a piece of scrap metal. It was a small brass handle buried beneath the earth. Ethan looked at Bear, then back at the hidden object. His grandfather had not left him nothing. He had left him a mystery. The brass handle buried beneath the earth stayed on Ethan Walker's mind all night. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image. His grandfather's old farmhouse. The forgotten corner behind the barn. And Bear standing there as if he had discovered something that had been waiting for decades. Early the next morning, Ethan returned to the spot with a shovel and a flashlight. The German shepherd followed closely, calm and focused. The ground around the brass handle was covered with years of leaves and dirt, but beneath it was a wooden door built into the earth. It was not large. It was not obvious. It was the kind of thing someone would miss unless they knew exactly where to look. Ethan carefully cleared the area and lifted the door. Underneath was a small underground room. The air smelled like old wood and paper. A narrow staircase led down into a space that had been untouched for years. Ethan stepped inside slowly, and Bear followed beside him. The room was not filled with gold or expensive items. There were no signs of wealth. Instead, Ethan found shelves filled with boxes, old photographs, military documents, and handwritten journals. It was not a vault of money. It was a vault of memories. Ethan picked up one of the photographs. It showed his grandfather standing beside several other men wearing military uniforms. He recognized the pride in his grandfather's expression, but he also noticed something else. These were not just old friends. They looked like people who shared a bond created through difficult experiences and years of loyalty. Ethan placed the photograph back carefully and opened the nearest journal. The handwriting belonged to his grandfather. The first pages described simple things: daily routines, farm repairs, family memories. But as Ethan continued reading, he discovered another side of the man he thought he knew. His grandfather had spent years helping other veterans after they returned home. He had created a quiet place where former soldiers could gather, talk, and rebuild their lives. The farmhouse was not just a family property. It had been a place of support and friendship. Ethan sat down on an old wooden chair inside the hidden room. For years, he believed his grandfather had been distant. He thought the old man kept secrets because he did not want to share his life. But now Ethan wondered if the truth was different. Maybe his grandfather had been protecting something important. Maybe he had been waiting for the right person to understand. Bear moved toward a different shelf and gently lowered his nose near a small wooden box. Ethan noticed and walked over. Inside the box was a collection of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The first letter was addressed to Ethan's grandfather. It was written by a Marine who had visited the farmhouse many years earlier. The words described how much the place had meant to him. It was not about the building. It was about feeling understood. Ethan read several letters, each one telling a similar story. His grandfather had created something that mattered, but he had never talked about it. The discovery changed the way Ethan saw the inheritance. The farmhouse was not an abandoned property. It was a piece of a story that had been carefully preserved. But one question remained. Why had his grandfather hidden all of this instead of sharing it with the family? As the afternoon light entered through the small window above the hidden room, Ethan continued searching through the documents. Near the bottom of a wooden cabinet, he found a sealed envelope with his own name written across the front. His heart paused for a moment. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his grandfather's. Ethan held the envelope in his hands, but did not open it yet. Something told him that whatever was inside would change the way he remembered the man who left him this farmhouse. Bear sat beside him quietly, watching as Ethan looked at the letter. The mystery was no longer about what his grandfather had left behind. It was about what his grandfather had been trying to tell him all along. Ethan Walker sat alone inside the hidden room beneath the farmhouse, holding the envelope with his name written across the front. For several minutes, he did not move. The old wooden walls around him were silent, carrying the weight of decades of memories. Beside him, Bear rested quietly, his head near Ethan's boots, as if he understood that this moment belonged to his human companion. Finally, Ethan opened the envelope. Inside was a single letter written in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. The first words immediately caught his attention. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then you have found what I spent my life protecting." He stopped for a moment. His grandfather had known this day might come. He had known someone would eventually discover the hidden room. The letter explained that the farmhouse was never meant to be a place of wealth. It was meant to be a place of purpose. His grandfather wrote about the years after his own military service, when he struggled to find his place in the world. He described the feeling of coming home, but not knowing where he belonged. Ethan read those words slowly because they felt strangely familiar. After leaving the Marines, he had experienced the same quiet uncertainty. He had spent years following missions and protecting others. Then one day, everything changed. The uniform was stored away. The routines disappeared, and he was left wondering what his next mission would be. His grandfather continued writing that the farmhouse became a place where veterans could find connection again. It was never official. There were no signs outside, no advertisements, no public recognition. It was simply a place where people could sit together, share their stories, and remember that they still mattered. Ethan looked around the hidden room. The old photographs, the letters, and the journals were not just family belongings. They were evidence of a lifetime spent helping others. For the first time, Ethan understood that his grandfather's silence was not because he had nothing to say. It was because he had spent his life doing things that did not need attention. Bear suddenly stood and walked toward the far corner of the room. Ethan followed his movement and noticed the German Shepherd was focused on another wooden cabinet. Inside the cabinet was a small metal container covered with a layer of dust. Ethan opened it carefully and discovered several old military identification tags, photographs, and a notebook smaller than the others. The notebook belonged to his grandfather's closest friend from the service. Ethan began reading the pages and discovered that the farmhouse had helped many people over the years. Some stayed for only a few days. Others returned for years. They all had one thing in common. They arrived feeling lost, and they left feeling remembered. Ethan closed the notebook and looked at Bear. The German Shepherd had not found a hidden treasure. He had found a hidden truth. The real inheritance was not something that could be placed in a bank or measured by a number. It was a legacy built through kindness and loyalty. Later that evening, Ethan walked through the farmhouse with new eyes. The old rooms no longer looked empty. The worn furniture no longer looked forgotten. Every corner carried a story. He noticed a small picture frame near the fireplace that he had missed before. Inside was a photograph of his grandfather standing beside a younger version of himself. Ethan looked closer and realized the photo was taken shortly after he joined the Marines. His grandfather had been watching over him from a distance all those years. On the back of the photograph was another message. Some people inherit things. Others inherit a responsibility. Ethan stood quietly as the meaning settled in. He had arrived at the farmhouse believing he received nothing. But now he understood something had been waiting for him all along. Not an object, not a fortune, a purpose. And as Bear looked toward the hidden room once more, Ethan realized the farmhouse still had more secrets to reveal. The farmhouse felt different to Ethan Walker after discovering the truth hidden beneath its floorboards. The same wooden walls that once seemed old and forgotten now felt like they were carrying a story that had been waiting for him. Every room seemed to hold a memory. Every object seemed to have a reason for being there. And with Bear walking beside him, Ethan began looking at the property not as an inheritance, but as a responsibility. The next morning, Ethan returned to the hidden room with a fresh notebook in his hand. He wanted to organize everything he had discovered. The letters, the photographs, the stories of veterans who had once found comfort. Inside the farmhouse, he needed to understand the full picture before deciding what to do next. Bear followed him down the steps and quietly watched as Ethan opened another box from the shelves. Inside were several documents that appeared to be records of the people his grandfather had helped over the years. Ethan expected names and dates, but what he found surprised him. Each document contained a short story. A few pages about someone who arrived at the farmhouse during a difficult season of life and left with a renewed sense of direction. One letter came from a former Marine who had visited the farmhouse decades earlier. The writer described arriving there feeling disconnected from the world after leaving service. He wrote that Ethan's grandfather never tried to fix everything. He simply listened. He offered a place to sit, a warm meal, and a reminder that every person still had value. Ethan paused while reading those words. He understood that kind of silence. During his own years after the Marines, he had not needed someone to solve every problem. He had needed someone to remind him that he was still needed. As the afternoon continued, Ethan searched through more of the hidden room. Near the back of a shelf, he discovered a small wooden box marked with a date from 40 years earlier. Inside was a collection of handwritten notes from his grandfather. Unlike the letters from visitors, these notes were personal reflections. His grandfather wrote about the people he met, the lessons they taught him, and the moments that reminded him why the farmhouse mattered. One sentence stood out to Ethan. The greatest things we leave behind are not things at all. They are the lives we touch. Ethan read the sentence several times. The words felt like they were written directly for him. For most of his life, Ethan measured success through duty and achievement. Military service, missions completed, responsibilities fulfilled. But his grandfather had measured life differently. He measured it through connections, through compassion, through the quiet moments when someone felt less alone. Later that evening, Ethan walked outside with Bear toward the old barn. The German Shepherd moved slowly through the grass, occasionally stopping to investigate familiar places. Ethan looked at the property differently now. The barn was not just an old building. The fields were not just empty land. This place had been part of something much larger. Near the side of the barn, Bear stopped again. Ethan watched as the dog carefully examined a section of the wall. There was no hidden handle this time. No obvious sign of a secret. But Bear remained focused. Ethan moved closer and noticed a small marking carved into the wood. It was the same symbol he had seen on several documents inside the hidden room. A simple design his grandfather had used many years earlier. Ethan traced the marking with his fingers and wondered what it meant. Back inside the farmhouse, he searched through the journals again and finally found a page explaining the symbol. It represented a promise. A promise that the farmhouse would always remain a place where people could find support. But beneath the explanation was another note. His grandfather mentioned that the most important part of the legacy had never been revealed. Ethan looked toward Bear, who was sitting near the doorway. The German Shepherd had found every hidden clue so far. And now, Ethan knew there was still one final secret waiting somewhere on the property. A secret his grandfather believed only the right person would discover. The symbol carved into the old barn wall stayed on Ethan Walker's mind long after the sun went down. It was not just a mark. It was a promise. A reminder that his grandfather had spent decades protecting something meaningful. But the more Ethan discovered, the more questions appeared. What was the final secret his grandfather had hidden? And why had he believed Ethan would be the person to find it? The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise. The farmhouse was quiet, except for the soft sound of Bear moving across the wooden floor. The German Shepherd had become part of the rhythm of the old house. Every morning, he walked through the rooms as if checking that everything was still where it belonged. Ethan smiled as he watched him. "You know something I do not, don't you?" he said softly. Bear simply looked toward the barn. Ethan followed. Inside the barn, they searched around the area where the symbol had been carved. Ethan carefully examined the walls, the shelves, and the old tools that his grandfather had left behind. For several minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Then Bear stopped near a wooden cabinet covered with old blankets. The dog lowered his nose and stayed there. Ethan moved the blankets aside and discovered a small compartment built into the back of the cabinet. Inside was a leather folder that had been carefully protected from time. Ethan opened it slowly. The first page contained a map of the property. But it was not a regular map. It showed areas of the farmhouse that no longer appeared on modern records. There were notes written beside different locations, each one connected to memories from the past. At the bottom of the page was a message from his grandfather. "The land remembers what people forget." Ethan looked at the map for a long time. He realized his grandfather had not been hiding things because he wanted secrets. He had been preserving pieces of a story that mattered. The map led to a location near the far edge of the property, beyond the fields where Ethan had not yet explored. He and Bear followed the path that afternoon. The walk took them through quiet farmland, past old trees and forgotten fences. The German Shepherd moved ahead, but always stayed close enough for Ethan to follow. At the end of the path, they found a small stone building covered by years of natural growth. It looked simple from the outside, but the door was made from strong wood and carefully maintained. Ethan opened it and discovered a room filled with more memories. Unlike the hidden space beneath the farmhouse, this room contained items from the people his grandfather had helped. There were photographs of families, notes from veterans, letters of gratitude. It was a collection of lives changed by simple acts of kindness. Ethan picked up one photograph showing his grandfather standing with several former Marines. On the back was a message. "We came here carrying heavy memories. We left knowing we were not alone." Ethan sat quietly after reading those words. He thought about all the years he spent believing his grandfather had left him nothing. Now he understood that his grandfather had left him something far greater than property. He had left him a purpose. Bear walked over and rested beside him. The German Shepherd did not need to understand the words. He seemed to understand the moment. As the evening light entered through the small window, Ethan continued searching through the room. Near the back shelf, he discovered another sealed envelope. This one was different. It had no date, no name, only a single sentence written across the front. "For the one who chooses to continue." Ethan held it carefully. He knew whatever was inside would reveal the final part of his grandfather's plan. The farmhouse had already shown him the past. Now it was preparing him for the future. Ethan Walker held the sealed envelope in his hands for several minutes before opening it. The small room on the edge of the property was quiet except for the gentle sound of the wind moving through the trees outside. Bear sat beside him, watching with the same calm attention he had shown since the day they arrived at the farmhouse. The German shepherd had discovered hidden places, forgotten documents, and pieces of a family story that Ethan never knew existed. But this moment felt different. This envelope was not just another clue. It was a message meant specifically for him. Ethan carefully opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was his grandfather's. The first sentence immediately caught his attention. "Ethan, if you are reading this, then you are ready to understand what this place was always meant to become." He continued reading. His grandfather explained that the farmhouse was never a place to store valuable objects. It was a place built around people. For decades, he had welcomed veterans who returned home carrying memories they struggled to share. He offered them a quiet place where they could sit, talk, and remember that their lives still had meaning beyond their service. Ethan lowered the letter for a moment. He thought about his own journey after leaving the Marines. He remembered the strange feeling of returning to ordinary life after years of following a clear mission. The world expected him to move forward, but nobody explained what moving forward was supposed to look like. His grandfather understood that feeling because he had experienced it himself. The letter continued with a request. His grandfather wanted Ethan to continue the work, not because it was an obligation, but because he believed Ethan already carried the same compassion. Ethan looked around the small room, filled with memories. For years, he thought his grandfather was a quiet man who kept everything hidden. Now he realized his grandfather had simply been someone who believed actions mattered more than recognition. Bear stood and walked toward a shelf near the corner. Ethan followed and noticed another small wooden box hidden behind several old books. Inside was a collection of dog tags, photographs, and handwritten notes. Each item belonged to someone who had visited the farmhouse over the years. Ethan picked up one set of dog tags and read the name engraved on them. They belonged to a veteran who had written one of the letters Ethan found earlier. The note attached to the tags explained that the farmhouse gave him a reason to believe in new beginnings. Ethan placed the items back carefully. The hidden vault was not filled with expensive possessions. It was filled with proof that kindness had a lasting impact. That evening, Ethan returned to the main farmhouse with Bear walking beside him. He carried the letter and documents carefully, as if they were something fragile. Sitting at the old kitchen table, he spread everything out and began organizing the story his grandfather had left behind. The photographs, the letters, the records, the memories. For the first time since arriving, Ethan no longer felt like a visitor. He felt connected to the place. Later that night, Ethan stood outside on the porch with Bear beside him. The fields stretched quietly under the moonlight. He thought about how different everything felt compared to the day he first arrived. He came believing his grandfather had left him nothing. Now he understood that he had received something much harder to find. A reason to continue. The next morning, Ethan noticed something unusual. Bear was standing near the old garage, looking toward a section of the property they had never explored. The German shepherd waited patiently until Ethan followed. Behind the garage was a narrow path covered by tall grass. At the end of the path stood a small wooden structure that did not appear on any of the property records. Ethan looked at Bear, then toward the forgotten building. Another secret was waiting. But this time, Ethan was not searching for what his grandfather left behind. He was searching for what his grandfather hoped would live on. The small wooden structure behind the old garage looked almost forgotten, but Ethan Walker had learned one important lesson since arriving at the farmhouse. The things people overlooked often carried the deepest stories. He stood at the entrance with Bear beside him, holding the old journal and the letter from his grandfather. The German shepherd looked toward the building with quiet curiosity, the same way he had looked at every hidden place that changed Ethan's understanding of the past. Ethan opened the door slowly. Inside was not another hidden room filled with valuables. Instead, he found a simple workshop. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Old tools rested neatly in their places. Photographs covered a small table near the window. The room smelled like cedar, paper, and memories that had been waiting for someone to return. Ethan stepped closer to the photographs. They showed his grandfather working on different projects around the property. But what caught Ethan's attention were the people standing beside him. Veterans, families, neighbors, people who looked like they belonged there. In the corner of the room was a large notebook with a faded cover. Ethan opened it and discovered something different from the journals he had already found. This was not about the past. It was a plan for the future. His grandfather had written ideas about restoring the farmhouse, creating a permanent place for veterans and their families, and keeping the tradition of kindness alive for future generations. Ethan sat down quietly. He realized his grandfather had not been hiding a treasure. He had been protecting a dream that needed someone willing to carry it forward. Bear walked around the workshop and stopped near a wooden shelf. Ethan followed and found several small boxes labeled with different years. Inside each box were handwritten notes from people who had visited the farmhouse. Some were short messages of gratitude. Others were longer stories about how a simple conversation, a shared meal, or a peaceful place helped them during difficult moments in life. Ethan read one message written by a former Marine who visited the farmhouse many years earlier. The note said, "I came here feeling like my story was finished. I left knowing there were still pages waiting to be written." Ethan held the paper for a long time. Those words reflected exactly how he had felt after leaving the military. He had spent years wondering what came after service. Now he was beginning to understand that a person's purpose did not disappear when one chapter ended. Sometimes, it simply changed direction. As the afternoon passed, Ethan continued exploring the workshop. Near the back wall, he discovered a small wooden board attached behind an old shelf. It contained a list of names, dozens of names. Each one represented someone his grandfather had helped. At the bottom of the board was a final message. "The legacy continues when someone chooses to care." Ethan touched the words gently. The message felt like his grandfather was speaking directly to him. That evening, Ethan walked back toward the farmhouse with Bear beside him. The property no longer felt empty. It felt alive with stories. Every building had a memory. Every path had a reason. Every hidden place had revealed another piece of his grandfather's heart. But Ethan also understood something important. Continuing the legacy would not be easy. The farmhouse needed repairs. The old rooms needed attention. The dream his grandfather left behind would require patience and dedication. Yet for the first time in years, Ethan felt ready for a mission. Not one that involved orders or commands. One built on compassion. One built on helping others find what he had found himself. A place where they belonged. The following morning, Ethan began cleaning the farmhouse. Bear followed him from room to room, always close, always watching. While moving an old cabinet in the main hallway, Ethan noticed something behind it. A small mark carved into the wall. The same symbol from the barn. He carefully examined it and found a narrow wooden panel hidden beneath the paint. Ethan looked at Bear with surprise. The German shepherd stood quietly, waiting. Another piece of the story was still hidden, and Ethan knew his grandfather had saved the most important discovery for last. Ethan Walker stood in the hallway of the farmhouse, staring at the small wooden panel hidden beneath layers of old paint. For a moment, he did not move. After everything he had discovered, he had learned not to rush the secrets his grandfather left behind. Each hidden place revealed more than information. It revealed a piece of a man who had spent his life caring for others without asking for anything in return. Bear stood beside him, watching quietly as Ethan carefully opened the panel. Behind it was not a room filled with possessions. It was a narrow space containing a single wooden box, wrapped carefully in a faded cloth. Ethan carried it to the kitchen table and placed it down gently. The farmhouse was silent around him. The same farmhouse that once felt empty now felt like it was waiting for this moment. Ethan removed the cloth and opened the box. Inside were several items that seemed ordinary at first. An old pocket watch, a small collection of photographs, a handwritten notebook, and a final letter from his grandfather. Ethan opened the letter slowly. This time, the words felt different. They were not instructions. They were not explanations. They were a conversation between two generations. His grandfather wrote that he always knew Ethan carried the same qualities that had guided his own life. Patience, loyalty, a willingness to help someone even when nobody was watching. He explained that the hidden rooms, the letters, and the memories were never meant to make Ethan wealthy. They were meant to help him understand where he came from. Ethan paused while reading those words. For years, he believed he and his grandfather were separated by silence. Now he realized they had been connected by something deeper. They simply spoke different languages. His grandfather expressed love through actions. Ethan had been waiting for words. Bear moved closer and rested his head against Ethan's leg. Ethan smiled softly. "You found this for me, didn't you?" he whispered. The German shepherd looked up at him, calm and loyal as always. Inside the notebook, Ethan discovered the final part of his grandfather's vision. It was a plan to restore the farmhouse and reopen it as a place where veterans and their families could gather. A place where people could share stories, find friendship, and remember that they were not alone. His grandfather had started the work but never completed it. He believed someone else would one day understand the purpose behind it. Ethan looked around the old kitchen. He saw the worn wooden table, the faded walls, the quiet rooms that once seemed forgotten. Suddenly, he did not see an old farmhouse. He saw a beginning. Over the next several days, Ethan started making small changes. He cleaned the rooms, repaired damaged areas, organized the photographs and letters so the stories could be preserved. Bear stayed with him through every step, walking through the house as if he was part of the restoration. Word slowly spread through the small town that Ethan was bringing life back to his grandfather's property. Neighbors who had known his grandfather began visiting. They shared stories Ethan had never heard before. They told him about the man who always made time for others. They explained that his grandfather never considered what he did to be special. He simply believed people mattered. One afternoon, an older man arrived at the farmhouse carrying a small envelope. He introduced himself as someone who had known Ethan's grandfather many years earlier. Inside the envelope was a photograph Ethan had never seen before. It showed his grandfather standing beside the farmhouse with a younger bear-like German shepherd from decades earlier. On the back of the photograph was a message. Every generation needs a companion who reminds them to keep going. Ethan looked at Bear and felt the meaning behind those words. The discovery was not about what had been hidden underground or behind walls. It was about what had been built inside a person's heart. As the sun lowered over the fields, Ethan stood on the porch with Bear beside him. The farmhouse was no longer a forgotten inheritance. It was becoming what his grandfather always hoped it would be. A place where stories continued. A place where people returned. A place where a quiet legacy could live again. But Ethan knew the final chapter of his grandfather's message was still waiting. And it was not written on paper. It was written in what he chose to do next. The farmhouse no longer felt like a place left behind. For Ethan Walker, it had become a reminder that some things are not lost when people leave this world. Sometimes, they are simply waiting for someone with the right heart to find them. Months had passed since Ethan first arrived at the property, believing his grandfather had given him nothing. Now, every corner of the farmhouse carried a different meaning. The old kitchen table where letters were organized. The hidden room beneath the floor where memories were protected. The small workshop where stories of hope were preserved. Each place represented a piece of his grandfather's life, and Ethan finally understood the true inheritance he had received. The restoration of the farmhouse continued slowly. Ethan did not want to change what made the place special. He wanted to protect its character. The worn wooden floors remained. The old photographs stayed on the walls. The quiet atmosphere remained the same. He wanted visitors to feel what he felt when he first stepped inside. A sense that the walls remembered. A sense that every person who entered had a story worth hearing. Bear became a familiar presence around the property. The German shepherd greeted every visitor with calm attention, walking beside Ethan as he showed people around the farmhouse. Many who came were veterans and their families. Some arrived with stories of their own. Others simply came looking for a peaceful place to spend an afternoon. Ethan noticed something beautiful happening. The farmhouse was becoming exactly what his grandfather imagined. Not a monument, not a museum. A living place filled with connection. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Bear beside him, holding the old pocket watch he found inside the wooden box. He thought about his grandfather and the years they spent misunderstanding each other. He wished they had talked more. He wished he had asked more questions. But then he remembered something important. His grandfather had answered those questions in a different way. Through every person he helped. Through every letter he saved. Through every hidden message waiting to be discovered. The next morning, Ethan opened the final page of his grandfather's notebook. He had saved it until the very end because something inside told him it mattered. The final words were simple. A legacy is not what remains after someone is gone. A legacy is what continues because someone chooses to care. Ethan read the sentence quietly. Then he looked at Bear. The German shepherd had been there from the beginning. He had found the first hidden clue when Ethan saw only an old farmhouse. He had guided him through forgotten rooms and silent memories. But more than that, Bear had reminded Ethan to slow down and pay attention to the things that truly mattered. As the years passed, The farmhouse became known throughout the community as a place of kindness and remembrance. People came to share stories, reconnect with old friends, and find comfort in knowing they were not alone. Ethan never considered himself the owner of the place. He saw himself as its caretaker, someone trusted to continue a promise that started long before he arrived. One afternoon, Ethan walked with Bear through the fields behind the farmhouse, the same fields where he once believed nothing was waiting for him. The wind moved gently through the grass, and the evening sunlight covered the property in gold. Ethan stopped near the old barn and looked back at the farmhouse. He thought about how different his life felt compared to the day he received the inheritance. He arrived searching for something valuable. Instead, he discovered something priceless, a connection to his family, a purpose beyond himself, and a reminder that even the quietest acts of kindness can travel through generations. Bear sat beside him as they watched the farmhouse in the distance. No words were needed. Some stories are not remembered because of what people find. They are remembered because of what people become after they find it. And Ethan Walker finally understood that his grandfather had never left him with nothing. He had left him a reason to keep the light on for someone else.